Hey, everybody, welcome back. If you've been listening to MercyCast for a while, I have a favor to ask of you. I would love for you to email us. A few of you have recently, and it has been incredible. You've told me about things that are going on in your life, and this is really why the podcast is here. So if you want to get in contact with me, email me at info@mercycast.com. Also, I could use your help. Could you tell your friends on the social media, on all of the social media about us? Just tag us at MercyCastPod. That's all. Tell everyone about us so that we can just build this community. So thank you. And with that, let's dive in. Welcome to the MercyCast, where we are learning the art of compassion through the adversity of life. I'm your host, Raleigh Sadler. You've heard me say before that God's office is at the end of our rope. And I think there is something to this idea of having no options, realizing that there is nowhere to turn, that you can't fix what's wrong with you. And in this moment, you are completely without an option, without help, and just speechless. Have you ever been there? I know I have. But what I've found is that when my back is up against the wall, some interesting things can happen. And typically, when the bottom falls out for me, or when I hit rock bottom, my life changes dramatically because at that point, I have to make a decision. As she sat in the endocrinologist's office staring at the MRI of her skull on the screen, the doctor pointed to a large mass crammed between her eyeballs. She knew at that point her life would never be the same. Today, I'm joined by Risa August, the author of the award-winning book, The Road Unpaved, Border to Border with a Brain Tumor and a Bike. Risa, welcome to the MercyCast.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to be here, Raleigh.
So you and I have talked prior to this, and one thing I have loved is when you got that news, you didn't let it paralyze you. Could you describe kind of what happened in those moments after you got your diagnosis?
Well, the first thing that happened was, I don't know if it was my athlete mindset or something kicked in where I was like, okay, how do we just take care of this so I can get on with my life? So there was that layer. And then there was the layer of validation, feeling validated. You know, it took 7 years to diagnose, and being constantly discounted or dismissed by doctors. And I finally felt validated. And I think that was the most important thing for me in that moment, was finally someone hears me, someone's listening, and I finally have an answer.
So after 7 years, you get an answer, you're validated, you finally feel believed because you knew something was wrong with you.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
All these doctors seem to be missing it. How did that reality shape what came next for you?
I didn't realize the impact. Initially, I thought it was just going to be a short-term inconvenience.
Right.
But I quickly realized my life would never be the same, physically, mentally, and emotionally.
And like I said earlier, when we realize that our lives are not going to be the same and that something's going to change, it can be paralyzing. Did you deal with that?
Definitely. I think I was in this place of, well, this is who I was. And if I'm no longer this, what's my purpose? What's my point? What's the point of me existing? That was my whole identity. And when I say that, super over the top, just athlete, intense, also very rigid in her ways, a nice person, but just very particular and rigid in her ways, a perfectionist and always having to be right. And the list goes on.
It's interesting how difficult things can shake our identity. And you talk about the rigidity. You had found your zone. You had found your place. You found what you were good at and you liked it there. And now something is threatening that.
Yes. I was good at being a perfectionist and having the need to be perfect at everything, to be good at everything, and then all the rigidity that came with that.
And as a recovering perfectionist myself, do you feel like having all the options taken away from you with your diagnosis was somewhat freeing? Freeing you from that thing that you thought was working for you, but not really serving you like you thought it was?
Ooh, not at first. I felt like it was punishment at
Right.
first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, that seems to be, that seems to be the logic, right? Like, this isn't the way it should be. This doesn't fit. This doesn't work.
Exactly. Exactly. And I just remember being on the sofa one day. We have this large leather brown sofa in our living room, and I've been wearing these tattered gray sweatpants for, gosh, it felt like years, and this faded purple hoodie. And I was flipping through channels, which I never really watched a lot of TV, but now all of a sudden I'm confined. I felt like I was confined to this couch and flipping through channels and just, what am I doing? What kind of life is this? And it was at that moment that I consciously chose to live.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that idea. You were facing what was happening to you. You weren't denying it. And in that moment, you said, okay, we're going to move forward. And you've told me a little bit about how this has impacted you personally, but how did it impact your family?
I think it was, gosh, I'm sure there's probably people out there listening that could, this might resonate with, but having a diagnosis or illness or chronic pain or whatever you're facing can often feel very lonely. And I was diagnosed with a tumor at the base of my brain that you couldn't see. I was also diagnosed with a rare disease that visibly you couldn't see in me. And I was always the Rissa that just bounced back and did everything and was hardcore. And so people were keeping me in that role, whereas I was like, you don't understand. I can barely get down the driveway anymore. My brain isn't connecting with my body. My motor skills were different. Memory was different. Some cognitive stuff was different. And partly I was trying to cover a lot of that up. And partly it just wasn't visible or obvious in me. So people were holding me to that high standard that I was always conveying myself as to the world, if that makes sense.
No, it makes perfect sense because when you can no longer be resilient, your identity will take a hit. We always think that we can get back up and I can fix this. I can get back on a horse. But sometimes the horse leaves you. You're just laying there and you can't even summon up the strength to get up. And that's when you find out what's really going on in your life. That's when you have to make a decision, like you said. And so you did make a decision. Tell me about that. Tell me about what you did next.
Yes. So I remember feeling, and this part always sounds a little dramatic to me, but I remember feeling like, okay, I needed something to live for. Either prove something to myself, prove something to all those people that were telling me I shouldn't, or I couldn't do this or that anymore, or I wouldn't do that anymore. And
Yeah.
I was like, no, wait a minute. I'm going to do something, but I'm going to do it for me this time. Instead of proving to the world, I'm going to prove it to me. And so that's when I decided I was going to ride my bike from Canada to Mexico. Naturally, right?
Well, for a perfectionist to say, or a recovering perfectionist to say, I'm not trying to prove this to the world anymore. I want to prove it to me. That's big. That's like a revolutionary thought, right? Because we're so focused on proving ourselves by being the best we can be so that we can receive love, so that we can be enough. And in that moment, you're like, no, I'm doing this for me. And so you jump on a bike. Tell me more about how that process went, because you've told me that you were an athlete. And I'm sure at this moment, with realizing that you have the brain tumor, you may not feel like you're 100% at your game?
I had no idea how I was going to accomplish this, but I knew I would. I just knew I had it in me. And I had 14 months to do it, like to train for it. And so I knew, okay, I have to get off the couch. And it wasn't necessarily that, oh, I'm just going to lay here and be lazy. I physically was exhausted, and I couldn't even imagine. I wasn't allowed to drive, but I couldn't even imagine like getting in a car and going to a grocery store. So my first goal was the mailbox, just getting down the driveway to the mailbox. I'm going to go get the mail today. I have a house out up on the hill, and I would stare through these big sliding glass doors down at that mailbox. And I would say to myself, maybe today's the day. Maybe today's the day I get to the mailbox. And I eventually got to the mailbox. And I also began painting, which was, I know it has nothing to do with like endurance sports or anything, but again, I needed something. So I found a creative outlet. I found like a mindfulness based opportunity to just immerse myself in something that I could do. And I began selling my art around the world. And after painting in the mailbox, I started taking bigger steps, like walking my dog and going to the grocery store. And then eventually it was time to get on my bike for 5 minutes. And then that turned into 8 miles. When you're talking to someone who used to do 65 miles for fun on the weekend or something. So my 5 minutes turned into 8 miles. And then eventually I completed my first century or 100-mile ride post surgery. And I knew at that point, I was like, yeah, I got this.
You started with these small measurable goals.
Yeah.
And you built back up.
Mm-hmm. The key point in that, Raleigh, though, is I didn't judge myself with those small goals.
Wow. How did you avoid that? Was this a conscious thought of, I'm going to try to get to the mailbox, and you know what? Even if I only make it halfway, I'm going to look at it from that perspective, that I made it halfway today. Is that how you did it?
Yeah, it really turned into reframing those thoughts. So if I started sliding into that space of, I can't believe my goal is to make it to the mailbox today, when I used to hike 10 miles on my rest day. And I would consciously reframe that to, wow, my legs made it this far today. I'm so blessed. I'm so grateful. And then it just, again, it was this conscious reframing.
It's amazing how when we reframe our thoughts, like if we're used to that perfectionistic ideal of, what if I don't get this? I need this. What if I don't get this? To, what happens if I get this?
Mm-hmm.
Just that subtle tweak, it ultimately changes our thoughts, because as our thoughts go, so do we. We will ultimately find what we're thinking about in a lot of ways. And I love how you're like, okay, I'm not going to judge myself. I'm not going to pick myself apart. I'm not going to let perfectionism win. And I'm going to do something new. I'm going to do art. And then all of a sudden your art's selling around the world. And I'm sure this is building your confidence. And even though it's unrelated, you're becoming confident again. You're feeling useful again. You're feeling that you can contribute. And I'm sure that led to the next step.
Oh, I love that. I don't even know if I ever thought of that. I think I always thought of it as like, wow, it was such a healing process for me. And other people were supporting me in that healing process by purchasing my art, and they didn't even know it, But I love that. Yeah, perhaps on some level it did. It helped kind of build me back up, all the different parts of me. And I love that. I love that.
I went through a season where I was in a new place, living in a new state, and just not feeling connected. And I just started painting. And I didn't know that I was even good, but some of those things turned out. I was amazed. I was like, okay, I'm not half bad at this. And then it started to build up my confidence. And so I love how for you, you start painting, then you hit the road, and now you're doing this massive trail on the West Coast. Tell me about how that began and some of the challenges that you came across.
Sure. So I signed up for what's called a semi-supported tour, and that's where 10 people share a van to transport our gear to the next location that we ride to. And then we essentially follow the van, get our gear, and pitch a tent each night. And I thought, okay, this will make it easier on me. I had medications to think about that had to be kept cold in case of an emergency. We did have the van, access to the van in case of an emergency. And so I just thought, okay, I'll have this extra support, but I'm not going to use it. I don't
Okay.
want anyone. I want to be solo. I don't want to ride with anyone. I don't want to connect with anyone. This is my journey. I'm doing it for me. I need to
Yeah.
heal my soul, all that. And so I went in very much wanting to isolate myself away from other people, and that changed over the 6 weeks. But I had all kinds of challenges, and I don't want to give away too much because I wrote this whole journey in my book. But I had issues with my medication, which is not a straightforward medication and is extremely expensive. I had issues with some of, like a bike crash and gale force winds and crazy semis and RVs blazing past us on the road and not nearly knocking us over the cliff sides, and, just stories like that. And then being in a group, even though we all camped together and cooked meals together. And sometimes that was challenging as well, of course, when you have different personalities. And there were other issues. I was doing video posts for pharmaceutical companies, and that I struggled with that as well. So there were all kinds of things happening along the way.
Well, you talk about this idea that I think a lot of us face, this trying to heal ourselves by ourselves and then realizing that doesn't really work. Like seeing other people as a threat to our experience. Like, oh, there's people here. They're going to rob me of the purity of this experience. But then you find out in some funny way, those people are kind of the answer. And so, how did this community that was forming around you help you with the challenges that you were facing?
Oh gosh. I feel some emotion coming up around that. We all introduced ourselves like a couple weeks before the ride via email. So I did share with people like, hey, I'm recovering from this thing. I have this disease. I still have this tumor at the base of my brain, but I've worked hard for this and I'm coming back. And so when I came in, I think a lot of people had the idea they had to take care of me, and maybe even doubted me, doubted my abilities. And I proved them wrong quickly, but I really started leaning into connecting with each one of them. I'm actually better at connecting individually than in groups. And I really tapped into my genuine desire and value. One of my top values is connection. And so I thought, okay, I could sit here and fight these people and be angry at the world and be alone, or I could actually honor that top value of connection in myself and chat with these people individually. And I had some really special moments with the individuals on that trip, and we became a family. And one of my arch nemesis in the beginning of the ride became one of my best friends and one of my biggest supporters to this day. So I had to really put away my ego. And like you said, that having to heal myself on my own, I had to like surrender all that. And you know what? These people want to be here to support me and advocate for me. And they're doing it out of kindness and caring, not to take away something from me. And so I really had to shift my perspective on that and lean in.
One, it sounds like you had a shift of perspective, especially when someone who was your arch nemesis becomes one of your biggest supporters.
Yeah.
Did you see that coming? How did that happen?
Well, I won't reveal too much, but again, it was, partly a conversation we had, but also letting our guards down a little bit and having some fun. And also, he really pushed me to, I had like buttons and all kinds of things to pass out and talk about what I was going through along the way to bring awareness. And he was the one pushing me at stops, like, give them your button, go talk to them. When at first I was like, oh, but I realized like how extremely valuable that was and how much I appreciated it.
So you're on the Pacific Coast Highway, you're on your bike, you have this person pushing you to stay in your rhythm, which I think is so important because I think that's even when people talk about self care, they don't understand, or we don't understand, or oftentimes I forget that to do self care in the best way possible is to involve others in it. And so you have these people who are involved in your life. And I would say that's the way we're designed. We're not meant to do this on our own, but they're pacing with you. And this is a long trail that you're on. And so you hit the halfway point. How are you feeling at this point? What's going through your head? Are you thinking, I think I can do it? Or are you thinking, wow, this was harder than I expected, but I'm going to keep pushing on?
Yeah, it's interesting you brought that up about these people pacing with me because a lot of people from home were saying, why are you doing this? You shouldn't do this. You know, you could quit anytime. You could just like get on a plane and come back. And the group was like, Risa, you can do this and we're going to help you get there. And not that I needed them to bike for me or anything, but man, it was great to have that support and especially on those rough days. But I remember about the halfway point and I think it was San Francisco felt like the turning point. And I remember remember focusing on what it would feel like to get to the US Mexican border, what that would feel like. What would it look like? What would it smell like, taste like, sound, all of that. I remember really tapping into that and I would get butterflies in my stomach of like how amazing that would feel. And so that's what I would focus on. What would it feel like finished?
Well, in a sense, this experience that you're having is a picture of what we go through on a daily basis, because sometimes we can be at the halfway point in our lives, or we're not quite where we want to be, but we feel like we've made some progress. And sometimes we stop before we should. We quit even though we're doing okay because we can't see the end. And you just described beautifully the process of visualization. What would the food taste like? What would the air smell like? What would the sun feel like on my skin? Have you taken that process into your everyday life? What's that been like?
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, I do it mainly with any kind of goals I have. And trust me, some days those goals are getting to the grocery store or getting it all done. How am I going to get it all done today? And, and sometimes it does come down to, okay, I'll feel productive if I get these 3 out of the 5 things I want to get done today. And if I get those other 2 things done, great, added bonus. But sometimes it is going back to those small steps and then associating like, okay, if I get all this done, I will feel accomplished or productive or ready for tomorrow or whatever. I guess in my mindset is, okay, what will that get me? Well, it'll get me a feeling or a sense of ...
Yeah, you're reminding yourself of the reward.
Yeah.
I have to go through this. There's no way around it. But here's the good thing that will come out of it. And here's how things will shift. I remember when I was a little boy, I was 12 years old, and I got really, really sick. And to the point that the cover of Florida Today was talking about this sickness that I got. people in the state are wondering about what's wrong with me. And I was just being poked and prodded. And I'm 12 years old and I'm losing weight like crazy because I can't eat. And many people were afraid I was going to die. And I remember my parents just had to leave the hospital for a little bit just to get some respite because they had been there through the whole thing. And almost as soon as they left, a nurse came in to take blood. And I was so
Mm.
frightened. And she looked at me, and I'll never forget her words. She said, "Okay, this is scary. I know. It's okay. But I want you to do something for me." I said, "Okay." And she goes, "I want you to think about what this is going to feel like when it's over.
Mhm.
Put your mind on that. Think about how you're going to feel when I'm no longer in the room, when the needle's no longer in your arm. And I want you to focus on that. And I want you to really just put your energy into that." I said, "Okay." And it helped. And I had no idea at 12 years old, she was teaching me how to visualize and how that could change my life and how that could change my perspective and how that could change the way that I faced adversity. And so you're here and your body is tired. It has to be tired. You've got your friends back home saying it's okay to quit. We know you're tired. You've already done so much. But then you have your friends who are suffering with you, who are learning compassion through adversity. And they're saying, nah, you can do this. Look at the objective record of what you've already done. And so they're showing you this objective record while you're also saying, okay, since I've done this, what's it going to be like when I hit the finish line? How am I going to feel? Do I really want to go home halfway? No. And so you keep going. And what was it like when you finally got to Mexico?
Well, this is an interesting question because it wasn't as exciting as I thought.
Yeah.
I definitely felt accomplished, but I realized at that point, wait a minute, this isn't where it all ends. Like, I have to keep going. And my life is still back there, back at home, and I still have things to face. And essentially, my road was going to keep going. And so I felt accomplished. And my next question was, okay, did that. What next? And so it was another confidence builder, but also just another opportunity for growth. Like, okay, it doesn't end here. It doesn't end at this border here. Like life goes on. My battle continues. So how am I going to face it now? How am I going to face it head on? What's my mindset going to be? What's my perspective going to be? And, and so I think more than anything, the trip, it wasn't about the physical fitness of it or the physical stamina. It was more about the shift in mindset and how I was going to move forward in my life.
Because what happens on trips like that is you think it's all about the trip when you're on it. But then you realize the little tiny lessons you learned were not for the trip at all. And the experiences you had may not be solely confined to that trip. That's for the rest of your life. You're learning things that you can take back and say, okay, this happened and this changed me. And so what does it look like now that I'm in my normal life? Because I don't say regular life, because I think on trips like this, you are more attuned to what life is than when you're distracted at home on your phone or when you're dealing with just the monotony of the day. But when you are in those moments, you are tuned into yourself, you're tuned into those around you, you're tuned into what's happening. And I think that is real life. But yeah, I
Mm.
think it's the lessons that we learn when we're experiencing life in its purest form that we can take back and say, okay, this is how I want my life to look like now. And I'm going to put energy into that. Was that a transition for you?
Oh, absolutely. I knew I wanted to connect with people more. Like you were just saying, I wanted to be more connected. I really wanted to start prioritizing what felt like the important things in life. And I wanted to step more fully into who I was, who I felt I truly was, and who I maybe had been dimming or suppressing. I'm not sure the words I want to use around it, but I really wanted to live my life full out and be the best person I could be. constant and never ending improvement and grow and learn and connect and all the things and try all the things, not just 1,800-mile bike rides. I wanted to start going to theater and live music and taking art classes and dance classes. And I wanted to experience life more fully and intentionally.
You know, it's interesting. As a person of faith, I've always clung to this verse in scripture. It's in the book of John, chapter 10, verse 10. And Jesus is saying, I've come that you may have life and have it more abundantly, or have it to the full. And I think oftentimes in our distractions, we limit ourselves from experiencing just the good and the bad. And that's the beauty of life. And I think to have a full life, it's going to bring up a lot of emotions. It's going to challenge us. It's going to be hard. But in avoiding the hard, we're missing the life. And I think your story is such a beautiful example of that. Is like you faced it and you felt as if you had nothing to lose. And how do we get there?
Again, I think, like you were saying, it's about limiting ourselves to just good or bad, like not limiting ourselves to just good or bad, and expanding our mindset, like opening up to possibility. And when this actually reminds me of a trip I just took riding my bike across northern Spain on the Camino de Santiago. I was there for a month. It actually was one of the most challenging trips of my life. And I've traveled a lot. I've been to over 25 countries and all over the US, and I've done amazing things in my life. And it challenged me in every way, physically, mentally, emotionally. And it was not one of my favorite experiences, but it was my experience. And I am so grateful I had it. I would not have traded it. Like, I'm so glad I got to do that. And maybe my old mindset might have been like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I wasted the money on that. And I did that. And oh my gosh, it was the worst trip of my life. I might have even left early. Who knows? But now when people are like, well, how was Spain? Was it amazing? I'm like, no, but I'm so grateful I got to do that. It was amazing in that respect that I got to experience it.
Well,
I got to feel all the challenge of it.
the Camino provides, and it may not provide you what you want in the moment, what you're comfortable with, but it provides us with what we need. And what I've found is every Camino de Santiago, every pilgrimage I've gone on, every one of them's different.
Yeah.
When I talked to you before, I was so amazed when you were describing this idea of, well, I got on my bike and I went across northern Spain, and I'm like, did you go on the Camino? And you're like, yes. And I think we had just missed each other. But what's funny is I walk the Caminos and I've seen people ride bikes, and sometimes the pilgrims, or in Spanish, peregrinos, like as the peregrinos are going, the ones who are walking can look at the ones on the bike and be like, no. I know one guy, he would say, you're supposed to say buen camino, like buen camino, have a good way. But he was saying mal camino to the bikers, because he was to the cyclists, because he was like, you guys are getting in our way. It's two completely different journeys.
Yeah.
But I'll never forget, I had one of those moments like you described where I kind of got a little cocky, and I was like, this is my third Camino and I'm good at this, and I might even write a book on it. And I'm just like feeling myself here, and I'm kind of just being judgy. I'm being judgy of the people who get blisters so easy. And I'm like, did you even train? Like, do you even Camino, bro? Do you even know? And so now I'm getting cocky, and I didn't get blisters. I even changed shoes in the middle. My original shoes wore out. I didn't get blisters after that. One started to pop out and it went right back in. It was great. I'm real proud of myself. What I didn't prepare for was the food poisoning. And when I got food poisoning, it wrecked everything. Mr. I can do this in my own strength, who I could do 42 kilometers in one day in the heat of the day. I can't even do 10 kilometers. I have to take 5 breaks to do 10 kilometers. I have to take a couple of days off or a day and a half off. My body is exhausted. And I'll never forget going into the place where I was staying, and it was dorm style, and they're called albergues. And I'm just getting sick. And I had already hiked, 32 kilometers with food poisoning, but now my body's like, no, there's time. There's a reckoning coming, and I'm just getting sick. I'm laying on the floor, and these 2 Spanish men are helping me, and they're checking to see if I'm alive because my legs are under the stall in a public restroom, and it's bad. It's bad. I look like I'm dying, and they're like, "Are you okay?" And it was funny because later that night they checked on me again, and I still was feeling bad. And the next day when I had to leave at 8:30 in the morning because they have rules, those 2 men were like, "We were really worried about you. We're glad that you are at least moving. We want you to have a good Camino." And it amazed me because 1, I was humbled. But 2, I saw that the people who were having a different experience than me, I realized that we were on the same journey, and it really changed my whole perspective of cyclists on the Camino. And I really truly respect the cyclists because some of the uphills that you have to do, yeah, you get the downhill. But those uphills, when you're going with the pedals, that's brutal. And so I'm amazed that you did it because, yeah, it's hard. and so, and I've just been amazed just to have that sneak peek into the cyclist community. Did you experience that? Did you experience other cyclists coming alongside of you and being like, okay, it's tough, but how are you doing? We're with you. Did you experience that?
I feel like I actually had more support from the hikers. I rarely saw a female cyclist. The reason I chose to bike was because my body physically I can't walk that far without too much pain anymore. And so that's why I chose to bike, and biking became my place of strength and comfort. But a lot of the cyclists were men, and I wouldn't say unfriendly, but just I didn't make the connections I thought I would. And here I went on this trip wanting to connect. This time it was quite opposite from my Pacific Coast tour. I wanted to connect. I wanted to be around people. And I actually was alone for much of the time. I did end up connecting with an English fella, and we rode together for a few days. And that really actually boosted my confidence and not feeling so alone in the journey, for sure.
Yeah, because you have some people who don't speak English. There was a day for me where everyone was European, and this one guy who I never really talked to, but he was from Australia, he came up to me and he's like, "Hey, can I sit next to you?" He was an older man. And he's like, "Can I sit next to you?" And I said, "Sure." He's like, "Because honestly, it's just nice to be around someone who speaks the same language." Like, we didn't have much in common, but in that moment, we were blood brothers because we had that common language. And sometimes that can wear on you, regardless of where you come from, whether you speak
Yes.
English or Italian or Spanish. You can, if you feel isolated, it can be hard. And I love how you talk about how you started to feel better because you were around someone who was experiencing what you were experiencing with you.
Yeah.
And I respect it. I respect you being on a bike because I don't know if I could do that because I really did. I got to a point where I would watch you all go up some of these hills and I'm like, that looks agonizing. Sure, you get the downhills, but that part, and some of the places, like you couldn't even ride a bike through. You had to walk your bike, which looked just awful.
Yeah. Pretty gnarly. Yeah. Some spots.
But you did it.
But I did it, and I experienced all of it, and all of it.
And what was that feeling like when you were pedaling into Santiago de Compostela and you're going to the cathedral and you can hear the bagpipes playing in the background?
Oh my gosh. Oh, I have the goosebumps thinking of that right now. I remember I started going the wrong way. My map was taking me the wrong way into town. And this cyclist, he must have been a local. he whistles at me and he's like, no, this way. And he led me all the way to where the arch is and the bagpipes are playing. And I remember getting into the piazza or the plaza area, and I just started bawling. I was so humbled and happy and exhausted and just all of it. And I bawled. I just bawled and took a few photos and relished in the moment and smiled all the way to get my certificate and cried and smiled and cried. I felt all the emotion.
I love that. You didn't run from it, because you've mentioned that before in this conversation. You felt all of it. And I love that, because that's this idea of being whole. You're experiencing the good and the bad. You're not trying to avoid either. And you're embracing life with all the challenges that it has. And I think that's what changes you, because I think oftentimes when we get to the end, it's not what we expect, but then we realize in reality, it's not the end. That's prelude to what's coming. And you're on a greater Camino now. You're still walking it out. Even though they say, even though the walking is done, your Camino is not. And I love that you're bringing that in, that you wrote a book on it, that you're sharing it with the world. And just the response that has happened to your book tells me that it's connecting with people. And so how would you encourage us to live like we have nothing to lose?
Yes. Don't limit yourself in life. Obstacles aren't there to block us or stop us in our tracks. They're simply something to navigate, whether we go around them, over them, under them, or through them.
Yeah.
They're not there to stop us. It's just a matter of shifting perspective. Going back to the Camino, I could no longer walk it. It didn't mean I still couldn't do it. I just had to figure out a different way. So I hopped on a bike. And so where in your life are you limiting yourself? And where might you shift perspective? And what do you have to lose? Like you said, I have a mentor that always said to me, Risa, you can't get it wrong, so you may as well have a nice day.
Wow.
And I love that.
What a perspective shift, especially for a recovering perfectionist. You can't get it wrong, so you might as well have a nice day. That's refreshing. That's refreshing to hear. I really like that.
Yeah, if you're doing your best and being the best you can possibly be in each moment, can't get it wrong. And then you get to try again tomorrow. How lucky are we?
Yeah,
you're
dealing with house money at that point, right?
Yes. Love that.
Risa, thanks for joining me today. This has been good.
I'm so grateful. What a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Raleigh, for having me.